He believed he had her, until she vanished in silence, and something inside him broke. Not because she screamed, not because she begged, but because she didn't. Her absence echoed louder than her presence ever did. And in that echo, he met a truth more terrifying than rejection. He was no longer in control. You see, a man's illusion of power is fragile. It is not built on reality, but on her reaction. He feels powerful when she pleads. He feels dominant when she explains. He feels worthy when she seeks. But all of that is a mirror, not a throne. What she reflects, he believes, and what she withholds, he craves. This is the paradox of power in the masculine psyche. A Jungian paradox rooted not in strength, but in projection. The ego, that grand illusionist, whispers to him that control is love, that domination is connection, that emotional predictability is safety. But the truth, the shadow, is this. His sense of control was never real. It lived entirely in her willingness to dance to his rhythm, and the moment she stops moving, he realizes the song was never his. She is no longer a character in his narrative. She becomes the author of her own, and that terrifies him. Carl Jung once said that what you resist not only persists, it grows in size. When a woman withdraws not in anger, but in stillness, she becomes that silent resistance. She mirrors back to him not the version of himself he craves to see, but the void he tries to ignore, his insecurity, his longing to be irreplaceable, his terror of emotional exposure, and above all, his fear of becoming invisible in the eyes of the one he thought he controlled. This is not manipulation, this is psychology. And when a woman awakens to this dance, when she stops reacting, when she no longer feeds his ego with attention, she activates the first weapon, emotional scarcity. It is not punishment, it is precision. The absence of affirmation destabilizes him because it severs the flow of emotional confirmation his ego has been addicted to. Men are not drawn to comfort, they are drawn to challenge, to the unknown, to the woman who remains a riddle he cannot decode. She who walks through life with a self-sourced radiance, unshaken by silence, untouched by approval. She who does not ask for validation, but becomes the source of it in every room she enters. That's where his illusion begins to crack. He is no longer the sun around which she orbits. He is just another star in the vast cosmos of her becoming. And suddenly, she is no longer a reflection of his needs. She becomes the unmet need itself. The woman who does not need him becomes the woman he cannot stop needing. There is a certain kind of strength in her, not loud, not dramatic, but deeply unsettling to the man who seeks dominance through emotional certainty. She smiles, but does not chase. She listens, but does not explain. She observes, but does not react. Her presence is like poetry, open to interpretation, but impossible to control. And that mystery, that wild, elegant refusal to be contained, is the second weapon, selective silence. Silence, when wielded with grace, is not absence. It is pressure. It forces his mind to fill in the blanks, to replay every word, to question every gesture, to revisit every moment she gave him access, and wonder if it meant more than he realized. The feminine silence that is not born of fear, but of depth, is a silence that does not apologize. It is the silence of the high priestess, of the mother archetype who does not explain her love, of the anima, the soul image within every man that seduces not with noise, but with presence. In the absence of her reaction, his own emotions echo back at him like a scream in a cave, and the louder they grow, the more he realizes he is haunted, not by her rejection, but by her stillness. It is in this sacred vacuum that the ego collapses. The ego, after all, is a survival mechanism, a shell built from fear, dressed in armor, desperate to protect the boy within, the boy who was once unseen, unheard, unloved. And so he grew up learning to seek power as proof of worth. But power gained through external control is power that collapses when the outside world refuses to yield. And when she walks away, not out of bitterness, but embodiment, she holds up a mirror to that boy. He sees, perhaps for the first time, that love is not something to own. That control is not connection. That silence is not abandonment. It is a mirror. And if he is brave enough to look into it, he may begin to see the cracks in his own reflection. But if he isn't, he will panic. He will chase. He will try to bait her back into the pattern, with guilt, with charm, with silence of his own. But her third weapon awaits him there, strategic withdrawal. This is not retreat. It is a ritual of power reclamation. She is not running, she is rising. The withdrawal of her energy is not an act of rejection. It is a declaration. My worth is no longer available for negotiation. She no longer exists in his world of push and pull, of manipulation and reward, of dominance and submission. She has outgrown it. Now, he must face the one thing he's tried to avoid, himself. Without her reaction, he has no stage. Without her emotional labor, he has no audience. Without her light, he must confront his own darkness. And in that space, if he is not yet ready to evolve, he will collapse. Because the woman he once knew has been replaced by someone untouchable, not because she is cruel, but because she is conscious. He may still see her, on screens, in rooms, in dreams, but she is no longer accessible in the same emotional way. Not because she has become distant, but because she has become whole. And this wholeness, this unshakable embodiment, triggers the unraveling of his illusion more than any act of rebellion ever could. For the ego thrives on imbalance. It needs something to dominate, to fix, to feed upon. It cannot exist in the presence of sovereign energy. When a woman no longer dances to the choreography of his moods, when her emotions are no longer molded by his silence or his breadcrumbs of affection, she breaks the rhythm his ego depends on to feel significant. And so he falters, not because she wounded him, but because she stopped performing. To the unconscious masculine, this is chaos. And chaos is terrifying. Carl Jung understood that the feminine, in its purest psychological essence, represents the mysterious, the unknowable, the dark waters of the unconscious. The anima, when not integrated, becomes a projection, an object of desire, of obsession, of control. But once she withdraws, once she ceases to reflect his desired self-image, she forces him to face the neglected parts of his soul. The real feminine, untamed, unpredictable, sovereign, is not something the uninitiated man can possess. He must become worthy of approaching her by confronting his own darkness. But most men don't. They chase the illusion, not the truth. They chase the echo, not the voice. And so, they fall deeper into confusion, wondering why their old tricks no longer work. Why the woman they once held in emotional captivity now walks like a myth through their memories. Untouchable, radiant, unbothered. This is the effect of a woman who has learned the power of withdrawal, not as a tactic, but as a transformation. Because something sacred happens when she no longer allows herself to be baited, when she stops justifying her needs, when she no longer performs for a gaze that only half sees her. She stops waiting for closure, because she realizes the only real closure is self-reclamation. The only apology worth receiving is the one she gives herself, forever doubting her worth to begin with. And from that moment on, she is no longer a pawn in the game of emotional manipulation. She becomes the board. She becomes the rules. She becomes the prize. The illusion of masculine power collapses when the woman he once controlled no longer reacts, no longer chases, no longer clings. Because power, real power, is not found in dominance. It's found in emotional presence. And presence cannot coexist with egoic control. He cannot dominate what does not need him. He cannot conquer what is already whole. This is where the shadow begins to stir in him. The unspoken fear that maybe he was never the one in control. That maybe all along it was her attention, her emotional labor, her softness that made him feel powerful in the first place. And now, without it, he is left with only himself, his unresolved wounds, his adolescent need for admiration, his inability to sit in silence without unraveling. This moment is the initiation he never asked for, the emotional death that precedes rebirth. And yet, not all choose to be reborn. Some remain trapped, trying harder, texting late at night, sending vague apologies, trying to recreate the emotional supply they once had. But the awakened woman sees through this. Her nervous system no longer responds to his patterns. Her breath no longer quickens at his name. She no longer checks her phone for signs of his interest, because she has risen above the game. The man who once thought himself powerful now walks in a fog of uncertainty. He replays their last moments. He wonders if she truly cared. He tells himself she'll return, but deep down, he feels it. The subtle terror that she has already left. Not just his life, but his psyche. He may find other women. He may even find someone eager to please. But no one haunts like the woman who became a mirror and then shattered it in silence. Because she was never about drama. She was about depth. And the masculine ego knows how to handle anger, how to battle fire, but it does not know how to survive stillness. It cannot breathe in the vacuum left by her absence. This is why silence, scarcity, and strategic withdrawal are not just tactics, they are initiations. They are the psychological weapons that tear through illusion and expose the truth beneath. That he never owned her, that his power was borrowed, that her energy was a gift, not a guarantee. And now he must ask himself the question he has been avoiding all along. Not, does she still want me? But, why did I need to control her in the first place? That is the beginning of real shadow work. But that journey is his, not hers. She has other things to become, other worlds to build, other mirrors to clean that do not distort her reflection. She walks now not to be chased, but to be free, not to trigger regret, but to reclaim herself. And as she goes, he is left behind, not with blame, but with the invitation to finally become what he pretended to be all along. He may not take the invitation. Many don't. Most will blame her, demonize her, reduce her to the convenient caricature of cold, difficult, emotionally unavailable, because it's easier to label the awakened feminine as dangerous than to admit that her refusal to bend broke something brittle inside the untested masculine. Easier to say she was too much than to confront the fact that he never developed the capacity to meet her at her depth. But deep inside, beyond the words and bravado, he knows. She didn't destroy him, she revealed him. Carl Jung spoke of the individuation process as the journey of integrating the unconscious into consciousness, of making the hidden visible, the shadow embraced, the projected reclaimed. And when a woman withdraws her emotional participation, when she ceases to play the nurturing mother to his ego, she forces the unintegrated man to look in the mirror. And in that mirror he sees not just her absence, he sees himself. Not the version polished by charm and control, but the real one. The one still ruled by a fear of abandonment. The one who mistakes validation for intimacy. The one who never learned that power built on reaction is no power at all. That is the crack in his armor, and that is where the light could enter, if he dares to let it. But this script is not about him. This is about her. The woman who no longer flinches in the face of silence, who no longer withers under the weight of unmet expectations, who has stepped off the battlefield not in retreat, but in resurrection. She no longer tries to earn worth through performance. She no longer spins her identity around his attention. She has remembered who she was before he forgot her value, and now she builds not from pain, but from presence. Her silence is no longer a defense. It is a sanctuary. She has walked through the fire of self-abandonment and emerged with a spine of steel and a heart untouched by pleading. She sees clearly now, not just him, but herself. She sees the part of her that once thought she had to shrink to be loved, the part that interpreted breadcrumbs as feasts, the part that begged for table scraps of attention from a man who didn't know how to nourish anything but his own reflection. And she does not hate that part. She holds it. She thanks it. And then she releases it, like ashes scattered from a page she no longer needs to reread. This is the true power of the feminine, not seduction, not sacrifice, not survival, but sovereign self-possession, the kind that cannot be bought, the kind that cannot be begged for, the kind that does not shrink to fit the hollow heart of a man still searching for control. She walks now with the quiet confidence of a woman who knows that her worth does not fluctuate with the rise and fall of his moods. She is no longer a refuge for his unhealed wounds. She is not his emotional mother, his mirror, or his ego's playground. She is the storm, the silence after it, the soil that flowers grow in when chaos has passed. And though he may remember her, late at night, in the silence between his new distractions, in the stillness after another meaningless conquest, she does not wait for that remembrance. She no longer defines herself by his memory. She does not live in his mind. He lives in the echo of her departure. There's a strange shift that occurs when a woman reclaims her center. Men can feel it even before they see it. They feel the absence of need, the cold clarity of her presence, the way she no longer contorts to earn love. It's disarming, even terrifying, to realize she is no longer emotionally accessible, not because she's angry, not because she's playing games, but because she's at peace. There is nothing more unsettling to the ego than a woman who doesn't need it to survive. This is where many try to re-enter. Suddenly, messages appear, old words are repackaged as apologies, moments of connection are resurrected from the dead, because now that she's no longer available, he starts to believe she was valuable, But this too she sees through, because the awakened feminine does not trade her self-respect for recycled affections. She may respond, she may even smile, but she does not return, because return would mean regression. And she has already crossed the threshold. The energy she once gave him now flows inward, into her body, into her work, into her joy, into the sacred silence she used to fear, but now worships as truth. The absence of his voice has become the soundtrack of her healing. The space he left is now filled with her own breath, her own voice, her own rhythm, and in that rhythm she has remembered she was never too much. She was simply too vast for a man who could only love from a place of control. She doesn't need him to know this. She doesn't need the last word. Her life, lived freely, fully, and unapologetically, is the last word. Her freedom rings out like a bell he can no longer silence. In the hollow that once echoed with his commands, her laughter now resounds, rich, unbidden, alive. It mocks the emptiness he crafted by trying to cage her spirit. She discovered that power is not seized, it is awakened, and she awakened herself. He felt that awakening as a wound, not a cut that bleeds, but a friction that scorches, because it burned away every mask he'd mastered. It forced his projected fantasies of control to crack and crumble like neglected plaster in an abandoned temple. And in the ruins, he saw her stature rise. His hands, once weaving invisible strings between them, now found only air. In the absence of his script, she wrote her own. Each sunrise became a stanza in her unfolding epic. Each breath, a vow to never surrender her narrative to another's will. She moved through her day with the steadiness of a mountain, unyielding to storm, untempted by the lure of reaction. She did not march away in wreckage. She walked forward, unburdened, her silhouette framed by possibility, and that, more than any moment of rage or sorrow, unhinged him. For he had grown accustomed to her as an object of his emotional consumption, her tears, her pleas, her explanations feeding his ego like a ritual. Yet here she stood, unconsumed, shining a light so fierce that his illusions evaporated in its heat. She was no longer his source, she was her own. In Jungian terms, she had integrated the anima within herself and exiled its projection onto him. The archetypal dance reversed. Instead of him chasing the shadows of her depth, she invited him to pursue authenticity. But he lacked the map. He still wandered in circles, blinded by desire for a control that no longer existed. His emotional compass, calibrated by her old routines, spun wildly in the new magnetic field she had created. She offered nothing but presence, and that was everything. Presence that did not ask for permission, presence that did not negotiate for space, presence that did not demand her own value be confirmed. It was the sovereign presence of one who has claimed her center, and men have always feared centers they cannot topple. In the dark, he began to recite the old incantations. She was cold, she was distant, she changed, but words cannot resurrect the living. They cannot undo the metamorphosis that occurs when a woman stops seeking permission to exist fully. She had cast off the chrysalis of his expectations and emerged in her own light. No incantation could dim that brilliance. Yet, in his private nightmares, he confronted her truth. He saw himself, smaller, brittle, hollow, peering into the void she left behind. That void was not absence, but potential. It beckoned him to fill it with something real, accountability, self-inquiry, courage. Most men recoil at the invitation. They prefer the stench of familiar lies to the fragrance of unknown authenticity. And so, he fled back to the safe illusions. New games, new distractions, new facades. But none could mask the whisper that haunted him. She does not need me. That whisper spread like fire in winter, igniting every hidden fear. Fear of insignificance, fear of invisibility, fear of being just another passerby in her story. And for all his bluster, he could not extinguish it, because that whisper was the echo of his own truth. The truth that he had relied on, borrowed power, borrowed love, borrowed identity. And now the loan had been called in, overdue, irrevocable. Meanwhile, she thrived. Her mornings began with silence, a communion with the unvoiced self she once abandoned. In that silence, she discovered the language of her soul, a language not spoken with lips, but written in movement, in gaze, in breath. It spoke of boundaries that were no longer optional, of desires that were no longer justified, of wounds that were no longer wounds but doorways to freedom. She cultivated her gardens, literal and metaphorical. In the soil, she planted seeds of new dreams. In her mind, she nurtured seeds of new beliefs. I am not an echo. I am the source. And as they grew, they formed a sanctuary that no man's illusion of power could breach. He could storm the walls with excuses, apologies, pleas, even declarations of love, but he could not enter on his own terms. Only she could grant him access, and she withheld the keys. This was the third weapon brought to its full force: strategic rewilding. She was not simply absent, she was feral. She reclaimed parts of herself the world had tried to tame, her laughter unguarded, her tears unashamed, her dreams unedited. She ventured into spaces that once intimidated her: solo travel, creative ventures, unfiltered conversations with strangers. Each step beyond her comfort zone rang bells in the forgotten corridors of her psyche, releasing echoes of possibility, and his illusion crumbled further. He realized he could no longer follow her, not because he lacked the will, but because he inhabited a different realm now. The gating boundaries he once controlled were his own making, and he had no choice but to wander void halls of his own mind. There, he confronted shadows he had long ignored: the child who feared rejection, the adolescent who sought admiration, the adult who mistook reaction for love. In a more awakened man, this confrontation would lead to individuation, a meeting with the self behind the mask. But most men sidestep the path of integration. They scurry back to the shreds of their projection, trying in vain to stitch reality back into the comfortable tapestry of his illusion. Yet the tapestry rips whenever she appears, too vivid, too alive, too real. She had become not a conquest, but a threshold. He either crossed into true self-awareness or remained trapped on the other side, forever echoing her departure. And in that echo, he felt both fury and longing. Fury at the loss of control, longing for the comfort of guaranteed admiration. But comfort is death to the soul. It is the anesthetic that dulls growth. And she had opted for life over comfort. Through her transformation, she showed him the radical possibility that love is not something to be captured. It is something to be shared, but not at the expense of self. She exemplified that the greatest love story begins within, the union of fractured parts, the acceptance of shadow, the reclaiming of power. And once that love story unfolds, no external force can write its ending. He may reach out again, tentative, cautious, hopeful, but she listens now with discernment. Not every apology deserves forgiveness. Not every promise deserves trust. Not every gesture deserves a place in her reclamation. She weighs each approach against the metric of her wholeness, and many falter under that measure, for they lack the substance to match the standard. Meanwhile, she continues her ascent. She builds communities rooted in self-respect. She mentors other women who still tremble under the weight of seeking. She writes, she speaks, she holds space for the raw human experience. In each act of creation, she reshapes the narrative he once tried to script. She becomes the author, the protagonist, and the muse of her own mythology. In this mythology, a man's illusion of power is but an incidental myth, a cautionary tale of the dangers of projecting one's ego onto another's soul. And she is the heroine who survived the shadow of his need and emerged luminous. He watches from afar now, a spectator in the theater he once directed. Sometimes he applauds, sometimes he winces, but he cannot dictate the performance. She has taken up the conductor's baton and leads with a tempo that echoes through the chambers of possibility. And deep within him, if he listens closely, he hears a different rhythm, the beat of a pulse that calls for his own rebirth. But rebirth requires surrender to the unknown. It demands that he risk the emptiness, risk the silence, risk the loss of any borrowed narrative he still clings to. Many will not, but the seed has been planted. In the end, the true liberation lies not in him chasing her, but in both of them walking separate paths toward the same truth. That power is not a game to win, but a sovereignty to claim. And she has claimed hers. She does not flaunt it. True power never shouts. It emanates, quiet as breath, steady as tide, strong as bone. It radiates in the way she speaks with no need to be heard, in how she enters a room with no desire to dominate, in how she gives her attention like a gift, not a plea. She is no longer the woman who begged for closeness. She is the woman whose distance awakens craving, not because she withholds in cruelty, but because she no longer offers herself on altars of uncertainty. Her offerings now are sacred, rare, deliberate, reserved for those who speak the language of soul, not ego. There is something holy in the way she withholds. It is not coldness, it is discernment. And that discernment burns through every false performance, every hollow gesture, every emotionally illiterate approach that used to ensnare her. He sees this, perhaps not consciously, not entirely, but he feels it. In the tightness in his chest when he scrolls past her photo, in the tension in his throat when he hears her name, in the way his mind begins constructing reasons to reach out and collapses under the weight of her likely indifference. He tells himself stories. She probably still thinks about me. She'll understand if I just explain. But these stories are echoes of the old illusion, the illusion that she still exists within the gravity of his pull. But she has reoriented her entire solar system. Her gravity now pulls inward, toward the sacred garden of her own becoming, toward the woman she abandoned for him, the self she silenced so she could be more lovable, more pleasing, more tolerable. She reclaims that self with each breath, and the space where he once reigned is now filled with art, with laughter, with sisterhood, with stillness. She has replaced performance with presence. She no longer contorts her shape to match another's hunger. He may not understand this transformation in language, but he understands it in sensation, because he feels her absence not as a gap to be filled, but as a weight pressing on his soul, a weight shaped like the truth, that she is gone, not missing, not hiding, gone, gone from the script, gone from the role, gone from the illusion. And more than that, she's not waiting to return. She's not frozen in time, hoping for redemption. She's moving, expanding, evolving. The woman he knew is now a chapter. The woman she is becoming is the entire book. This terrifies the unhealed masculine, because he thought he could always come back, that the doors would creak open with a single knock, that the strings would still be there, ready to be pulled. But a woman who has tasted her own sovereignty never slips back into strings. She becomes rhythm. She becomes silence. She becomes storm. And here lies the deepest truth of all. The feminine does not seek to destroy the masculine. It seeks to initiate it. But not all men are ready for initiation, because initiation requires death. The death of ego, of entitlement, of the illusion of control. Initiation demands surrender. And most would rather dominate than surrender. Control than commune. Perform than transform. But for those few who see her not as a possession, but as a mirror, a guide, a force of becoming, they glimpse what lies beyond the power struggle: reverence, stillness, awakening. This, Carl Jung understood deeply, that to integrate the anima is not to conquer it, but to allow it to reorder the psyche, to let it teach you how to feel, how to yield, how to be. For the anima is not weakness, it is the bridge to wholeness. And the woman who masters these three weapons, emotional scarcity, selective silence, and strategic withdrawal, is not waging war. She is restoring balance. She is withdrawing from false power to embody true presence. She is removing her light not to punish, but to remind that her light was never a given. It was a grace. He who cannot hold it will lose it. He who tries to own it will burn. But he who can see it, truly see it, and bow, not in submission, but in respect, he may, if invited, enter her kingdom, not to rule, but to revere. And should he fail, should he try to reclaim her through shame, through noise, through need, he will only be met with one thing: silence. That vast, sacred silence in which his illusions dissolve and her radiance remains. Because this woman, the one who shattered the illusion of power and walked away without rage or regret, she is no longer a participant in his ego's theater. She is the goddess who left the temple, and the temple now crumbles in her absence. There is no script left, only echoes, only stillness, only the sound of a woman reborn. And if he ever truly loved her, not her need, not her reflection, but her, then he will not chase. He will rise. But even if he does not, she will remain, whole, holy, unchained. She no longer walks to be seen. She walks because her feet remember the path that leads home, to herself. There is a silence that follows her now, not the kind born of suppression, but the kind born of arrival. It is not lonely. It is not bitter. It is the deep, womb-like quiet of a woman who no longer seeks answers outside her own breath. The quiet of someone who no longer measures her worth by how deeply she is desired, but by how clearly she sees herself. Her silence is no longer empty. It is full of clarity, full of knowing, full of sacred boundaries formed from years of forgetting herself and finally remembering. When she loved him completely. But even then, part of her knew. She was teaching herself how to leave. She did not withdraw to punish him. She withdrew to resurrect herself, to retrieve the scattered parts of her psyche that she had once placed in his hands, like fragile offerings to an altar of imagined devotion. And when those offerings were ignored, misused, or crushed, she grieved. Not just the man, but the self that allowed her soul to shrink for the illusion of safety. Now she stands tall, not hardened, but whole. The edges she once softened to be loved have grown back in bone. She speaks less, but means more. She listens not to react, but to discern. She loves, not to be chosen, but because love is her nature. And now she knows how to aim it wisely. A man who meets her now will not find an open door. He will find a gatekeeper, not a wall, not a prison. A woman who chooses who enters, and more importantly, who doesn't. For this is the final evolution of feminine power, to choose. To choose when to give, when to stay, when to speak, and when to disappear like smoke from a sacred flame. And in that choosing, she reclaims the most divine truth of all, that she was never meant to be consumed. She was meant to be witnessed, not conquered, but bowed to, not explained, but felt, not decoded, but adored. Now, when he thinks of her, and he will think of her, he won't remember her neediness, because it's gone. He won't remember the version of her who cried for his attention. She no longer exists. He will remember the day she stopped explaining, the moment she didn't call back, the hour he felt her absence like a blade in his soul and realized he was no longer part of her world, a world she built from ruin he left her in. But she never stayed ruined. No, she became ruin's alchemist. She turned pain into presence, grief into guidance, emptiness into elegance. And when he hears her name now, he doesn't think of the girl who used to wait for him. He thinks of the woman who outgrew him, the one whose silence echoed louder than any goodbye, the one who didn't yell or blame. She simply vanished, and the void she left behind spoke volumes. Because in the end, there are two kinds of women, those who wait to be loved, and those who remember they are love. She remembered, and from that remembrance she began again. In the eyes of the world, she may still look like the same woman, but to those who once held her in their grasp, she is unrecognizable, for she no longer bends, bows, or breaks. She no longer asks, begs, or proves. She simply is, a force, a current, a woman who walks through this world with the kind of stillness that rattles cages, the kind of grace that disarms arrogance, the kind of presence that makes men forget every woman who ever played small for them. She has become unforgettable, not by being loud, but by becoming real. Unapologetically, profoundly real. She no longer tries to be the woman he wants. She is the woman she needed when she was younger, the woman who could look her past self in the eyes and whisper, "You don't have to earn love by bleeding for it." She healed not because she was unbroken, but because she decided to become her own sanctuary. And when she stands now, in her silence, in her power, in her grace, there is no longer a need to speak of what was lost, only what was found. Because what he called distance, she calls dignity. What he called cold, she calls clarity. What he called unavailable, she calls divinely reserved. And what he once mistook as weakness has now become her greatest weapon. Not to destroy, but to decide. Because the woman who knows her worth doesn't chase, she chooses.